Hello, thank you to everyone for joining for our third Family Services webinar of 2020. Today's topic is anxiety, depression, and why it's important to talk about mental health. My name is Hope Newport, and I am the Family Services Manager here at the International FOP Association. We're joined today by our presenter, Brittany Talley, licensed professional counselor and registered play therapist at Rise Counseling and Consulting. Brittany provides individual counseling for children, teens, and young adults. She has a master's degree in counseling and guidance and a play therapy certification. Brittany's completed training in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and the attachment self-regulation and competency model. She has a brain story certification and loves to help clients understand themselves better by teaching them about their amazing brains. As a play therapist, she believes that play is for everyone and loves incorporating play therapy techniques into her sessions with clients of all ages. We are so fortunate to have Brittany connect with the FOP community to prepare for and present today's webinar. Our hope is that this presentation will serve as a starting point for some very rich questions and continued discussion of this topic. I'll hand it over to Brittany now.
With FOP and mental health. I talked a little bit with Danielle Coyne and she was so helpful, but I know that I will learn a lot from all of you today. So thanks again, and we're just going to jump in. So what we know is that our mental health, right, the things going on in our brain and our physical health are really closely connected. So mental health plays a huge role in our ability to maintain good physical health, and there's a lot of reasons for that. When we get into symptoms, you'll see why. Mental illnesses like depression and anxiety often affect our ability to participate in health-promoting behaviors, so things that are good for our physical health. In turn, when we have problems with our physical health, such as a chronic or rare disease, that can have a serious impact on our mental health and can decrease our ability to participate in treatment and then recovery. So I did want to just give you a little overview of what we'll talk about today, just kind of like a 101, right? A mental health 101, some specifics about anxiety and depression. And I'm actually going to talk you through how like a therapist would diagnose someone with anxiety and depression. And I'll give you some warning signs for different mental illnesses as well that you can kind of see. And then we'll talk specifically about FOP and mental health, and then how you can access treatment and then resources for treatment towards the end. So really, they define mental illness as any sort of impairment in your functioning. That's kind of the big thing. So you might feel sad or anxious, right? But if it's not impairing your day-to-day living, often that doesn't qualify as a diagnosis. So any mental illness is defined as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. It can vary in impact, and it can be like there's no impairment in your life, or it can be mild, moderate, or severe. And honestly, like when I was in school to become a counselor, we spent an entire semester learning about how to diagnose people and what that looks like and all these symptoms. And so I don't expect that this will cover everything in an hour. So just a heads up. And then a serious mental illness would be mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that results in serious functional impairment, and it definitely interferes with or limits major life activities. So that burden of mental illness is particularly concentrated among those who experience disability due to their mental illness. And that is one way that people will apply for a disability, is due to their mental illness. So just some facts. I think we often feel like, because the portrayals of mental health in the media or in books that we read, it makes it seem like everybody has a severe mental illness, but what we know is that mental illness is very common. In fact, 1 in 5, or about 20% of U.S. adults experience mental illness each year. And almost half of adults will experience mental illness in their lifetime. So that's the other thing that I like to bring up when I talk about mental health, is that having depression or having anxiety or PTSD, those things don't have to be permanent diagnoses, right? They can be temporary, they can come and go. And there's even some sort of, like, when you diagnose, specifiers that say, well, this is recurring, it's seasonal, and that kind of stuff. And so it's important to know that so many people experience issues with their mental health. It's like half of us, right? And I would imagine this number is pretty low. because this is probably self-report, right? So people are telling us this. We also know that about 5% of adults experience mental illness in any one year, right? But 5% sounds like not very much, but when we break that down, that's 43.8 million adults. And so I use the word mental illness, and that can be kind of a long-term mental illness, or it could be like a short, like a panic attack or a short episode of suicidal ideation. Any of those things would constitute mental illness. And we also know that usually the symptoms start early, right? Half of all mental health disorders begin by age 14, and 3/4 of them are by age 24, right? And actually that age between like 18 and 24 is when a lot of mental health issues start to pop up. There's some developmental things that are happening in people's brains and bodies that make that true. But also that's when we start doing things like people are becoming more independent, or for whatever reason becoming less independent, depending on what they've got going on in their lives. So it makes sense to me that we see a huge kind of like burst of movement around mental health in the teens and early adulthood. And then we also know that mental health is happening everywhere, but it's especially happening in our hospitals. And so 1 in 8 of U.S. emergency department visits are related to mental health and substance abuse disorders. And I always like to point out that substance abuse disorders are a part of mental health and are considered a type of mental illness. In fact, our new understandings of substance use are that it's actually a disease of the brain and the brain's reward system and how that functions or doesn't function appropriately. So I wanted to show you a brief video from NAMI, and that is the National Alliance on Mental Health. And this gives us kind of a broad overview of some warning signs that you might be looking for in yourself or in someone that you care about. So I'm going to play the video. Hopefully the sound works. If not, please let me know, and I will do some speaker things that I need to do.
Mental health conditions are more common than you may think. 1 in 5 youth or young adults lives with a mental health condition. Do you know the warning signs? Like feeling sad or withdrawn for more than 2 weeks. Severe mood swings that cause problems in relationships. Intense worries or fears that get in the way of daily activities. Sudden overwhelming fear for no reason. Or seriously trying to harm or kill oneself, or making plans to do so. Not eating, throwing up, or using laxatives to lose weight. Significant weight loss or weight gain. Severe, out-of-control risk-taking behavior that can cause harm to self or others. Repeated use of drugs or alcohol. Drastic changes in behavior, personality, or sleeping habits. Or extreme difficulty concentrating or staying still. If you see these signs in yourself or a friend, tell a trusted adult. The first step to getting help is to say it out loud.
Okay, so I like that video, one, because it's really short, but also because it gives, like I said, this kind of broad overview of a lot of different symptoms. Because I think one thing that we've sort of normalized is that, and hopefully we're normalizing it more, is that you do get to talk about these things. And so that's why in that first poll I was asking, you know, how comfortable are you talking about the way you feel with your loved ones? Because usually that's the first place that we start talking about how we feel. It's with people that we care about and that we trust. And so you becoming more comfortable with that is really important. And when we talk about treatment, it will also we'll also talk about where you go when those people aren't the ones you want to talk to about your feelings. The other thing that's important to remember is that even though our loved ones can be super supportive and they really want us to feel better, sometimes it really does help to have a person who's objective, right, in our situation. And that's why I think therapy is so important. I tell everyone I know, have you tried therapy? You should try it. Everyone should be in therapy, your whole family, every person you know. And we'll talk about some of the barriers to that and the reality of that today too. So those are just some, again, broad warning signs that you might be looking for. But I did want to talk really specifically about kind of the big diagnoses of depression and anxiety. And technically, there are quite a few what we call depressive disorders and anxiety disorders, but I'm going to really focus on the two big ones, which are major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. Now, if I'm talking through these things and they feel maybe familiar, or you might see that in someone that you care about, it doesn't mean that's their diagnosis. Again, depressive disorders and anxiety disorders are big categories, and these are just the two major ones and the two most common. We could probably do 1 to 2 hours on just one of them, so hopefully this will be useful when we talk about the symptoms. So we think about major depressive disorder. The biggest feature, and the one that is fairly obvious to most people, is this presence of like a sad mood, right? But for it to be a diagnosis, it needs to go further and be more than sad. And one of the words we use in diagnosis is this empty mood, right? So it's not just that they feel sad, it's that they feel kind of empty, maybe numb or nothing. And often in children and teens, that will look like irritability instead of a sadness like crying. It'll look more angry. So that's important to know. It also is accompanied by physical, like body changes, or even the way our thoughts are, and that can impact our ability to function. So really, to have a diagnosis of a major depressive disorder, you would have to experience what we call a major depressive episode over the course of 2 weeks. So for an entire 2-week period, you would have to be 5 of the following. So I've included 5 on the slide for you, but I'm going to read all of them so you can kind of hear them. So again, during a 2-week period, it would be depressed mood most of the day. Again, that would be more like irritability in children and teens. Diminished interest in previously enjoyed activities. And honestly, that's one of the ones that I look for the most. Like, are there things in your life that you used to love and now you don't care about? Like, you just could care, you just can't even manage to care about this thing that used to be everything to you. Significant changes in the way your body looks, so weight loss or weight gain. Sleeping too much or too little. I'd like to say that depression is one of those extremes, right? It has to be one or the other. Moving too much or too little, so feeling what we call psychomotor agitation. So you are either like jittery all the time, or you're totally still, almost like catatonic, where you're just kind of like a limp noodle and you don't move at all. But that has to be something that other people notice. Feeling tired and lack of energy. So I feel like that's one that it kind of sneaks up on people. So when I'm talking to someone in therapy, for example, and I'm going through some symptoms, asking them what's been going on, I'll ask them like, how's your sleep? And they'll be like, oh, well, I'm tired a lot. In fact, I'm tired all the time. And no matter how much I sleep, I'm still tired, right? That is that sort of like empty fatigue that we talk about with depression. And then feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt every day. So no matter how hard you work or how nice you are, you still feel like you have nothing to offer, or you feel guilty for things that really aren't your fault. The hard thing about diagnosing yourself, which you're not supposed to do, so please don't be doing that, is that a lot of this stuff, when you're inside of it, like when you're in a depressive episode, you're not going to be able to tell that your guilt isn't appropriate. It's going to feel very appropriate to you. And so that's why it's important that you have people in your life that can kind of say like, hey, I've noticed some things, popping up, and I'm wondering if you'd want to talk to someone. Some other symptoms are difficulty concentrating or making decisions. Now that's different from what we call decision fatigue. People who have like really high pressure on jobs, like teachers and nurses and doctors, they often experience decision fatigue because they make so many decisions throughout the day. So that's different from just not being able to make any decisions at any time. And then often recurrent thoughts of death, not just a fear of death, but thinking about their own death, including things like thinking about committing suicide or completing suicide with or without a plan. And so, again, I mentioned kind of the big ones on the slide, but the way that I would diagnose someone is to say like, okay, how many of these items do you feel are true for you? And if they meet kind of 5 of these criteria over the last 2-week period, I would be looking at a diagnosis of major depressive disorder for that. So the other thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is that the symptoms have to cause distress or impair their social, academic, or occupational functioning. So if someone feels like this, but they don't think it's impairing their functioning, that's very rare, it doesn't happen, then it wouldn't necessarily count. It can't be related to substance abuse or grief. Those two things are very different. And often the symptoms of depression mirror what happens when someone is either using substances or coming down off of substances. So those two things can't kind of go together. You either have one or the other. Often, though, grief can kind of morph into depression over time, right, if it's not treated. And then, again, these symptoms and the diagnosis can be mild, moderate, or severe. It can have other special features. I mentioned like a cyclical depression, or even you might have heard of seasonal affective disorder, where people who live in areas that have like winter, often in the winter time when there's less sunlight, they have symptoms of depression. And then as the sun comes back out, that lessens a little bit. And then another special kind of feature of depression might be postpartum onset. So there's been a lot of talk recently in mental health circles about postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. So that is just some info about depression. I have a little bit more that I'll share with you. One is that women are more likely to have depression than men. And that's related to a lot of things: biology, our life cycle, hormones, all these things that are unique to women might be linked to the higher depression rate. And usually when women are depressed, they have the more likely to have the symptoms that are sadness, worthlessness, and guilt. Men, on the other hand, they're more likely to experience the exhaustion, irritability, or angry mood, and they will frequently lose interest in activities they enjoyed, have sleep problems, and behave recklessly due to that depression. Older adults with depression may have less obvious symptoms, and they're less likely to admit those feelings of sadness or grief. And they might also have those medical conditions, right, that kind of play into their mental health issues. Again, with little kids, this is a hard one. What I have seen and what a lot of the research says is that kids are often more irritable. They're kind of just cranky all the time. And they might pretend to be sick, refuse to go to school, become really clingy, and not able to like separate from their caregiver. Even at an age when they've already done that successfully, then they're kind of going back and acting like they're much younger. And then older children and teens might start acting out at school. Again, that irritability, they might be really sulky or pouty. And then often with teenagers, we kind of see it's almost like this weird, like kind of culmination of symptoms where we see like depression symptoms, anxiety, eating disorder, like all this stuff kind of comes together in the teenage years just because of what's happening developmentally in their brains and bodies. So that is kind of an overview of depression. I will say that most clinicians, most therapists, social workers, counselors, we try to get a whole broad view of a person before we make a diagnosis. So I'm going to go through, we have something called the DSM. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and that is how we diagnose people. And that's where all these symptoms that I just read to you came from. And so we consult that, but we also will have them do other assessments. We might meet with them a few times before we make kind of a judgment about what diagnosis they have. So if you have questions about depression, please feel free to ask them in the chat and we'll kind of get to them at the end, or I can answer some now. Not seeing any. So I will move on to anxiety. I will say that we're going to talk briefly about toxic stress as well today. And so if I'm reading some of the symptoms to you and you're like, well, I'm not quite there, but I'm feeling this one thing, chances are it is related to toxic stress, and we'll talk about that too. So anxiety, right? The big one in the anxiety disorders is generalized anxiety disorder, right? That's kind of the most common, the one we see the most. With kids, I see a lot of social anxiety or separation anxiety, and it kind of will morph into generalized anxiety disorder as they grow. So one of the essential features of generalized anxiety disorder is this, again, excessive anxiety. It's kind of in the name, right? And this worry about a number of events or activities, and often that worry is bigger, right, than the actual event. And so that's one of the big warning signs. And that's how I would describe it to my kids, right? Your worry seems bigger than the thing you're actually worried about. So the intensity, duration, and frequency of those feelings, those big feelings, is out of proportion to the actual likelihood of the anticipated event. So the event doesn't even have to be a real event. It can be an event that they created in their head, or that they saw on TV, or that they heard about from someone, right? It doesn't have to be anything related to their real life for them to be worried about that. And I think that because I work with kids, that happens a lot. Kids are worried about things that are probably never going to happen. And so explaining that to parents is really important, that just because that event isn't likely doesn't mean it's not a real fear for the kid. So again, just like depression, the symptoms can't just happen once and then you have the diagnosis. They have to happen over a certain period of time. And for anxiety, that's 6 months. And so on more days than not, over a period of 6 months, we're looking for 3 or more of the following things. Restlessness or feeling on edge. One example is, are you just jumpy? Do you experience what we call hypervigilance, that every little bump or sound kind of makes you jump or your heart race? Are you easily fatigued, right? You do like one task on your to-do list and you're like, I'm done, I can't do anymore. Again, difficulty concentrating. Another thing we see cognitively in anxiety is the brain just kind of like, almost like it's wiped, like a dry erase board. So this mind going blank is another thing that happens a lot in anxiety. Irritability, anxiety, muscle tension. So one thing you may have seen on the internet, and I say to clients all the time, is like, pull your shoulders down from your ears, move your tongue from the roof of your mouth, and unclench your jaw, right? Because people who are anxious, their body just sort of gets tight over time. And so that's kind of, I think, where that term wound tight comes from. And then sleep disturbance. And so it can be difficulty falling or staying asleep, not being able to sleep, or sleeping and feeling like that wasn't unsatisfying sleep is what we call it. So again, these symptoms have to cause significant distress or impair areas of functioning, social, academic, or occupational functioning. And again, not related to substance use or another disorder. And so that's when we talk about diagnosis, we have these like decision trees basically that we use, where it's like, okay, is it this and not this, and then we go to the next one. Okay, well, do they fit this category? Because someone with anxiety disorder might also have panic attacks, and then that would actually be panic disorder. If the anxiety comes from a real event that they experienced and they're trying to avoid feelings of that event or are scared of that event happening again, it might actually be post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that's why it's important that if you think you have these symptoms, you definitely seek help from a professional to help you figure out exactly what's going on there. So these are the most, so just some more information about anxiety, and then I'll give you some more information about both. But the national prevalence data indicates that like 40 million Americans have anxiety, right? And that 8% of children and teenagers experience an anxiety disorder, and most people develop those symptoms of anxiety before 21. Only about a third of those with anxiety get treatment, and 1 in 13 people suffers from anxiety globally. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Brené Brown. She's a researcher, but one of the things she talks about a lot is that we live in an anxious world, right? We live in a world where bad things happen, and that makes people anxious about all kinds of things. And so our society and culture is kind of based in anxiety, and so it makes sense that so many people feel this way, right? That's kind of what we're bred and trained to feel. So just some other symptoms that I haven't mentioned, but that you might be looking out for that might be indicators of other disorders include, and might also be anxiety and depression, would be confused thinking or problems concentrating, right? We've talked about kind of that mind going blank, inability to make decisions. But if you notice that for some reason you just can't get your words out, or things just aren't making sense no matter how hard you try, it could be a symptom of something else going on. Extreme mood shifts, so really high happy moods and then really low sad depressed moods. Isolation and purposeful isolation, so you are purposely avoiding your friends and social activities. Difficulties like relating to other people, understanding social skills. This one makes people feel awkward, but changes in your sex drive, right? That can be one that nobody ever wants to talk about, but can definitely be a symptom of something. Difficulty understanding what's real and what's not. Inability to kind of perceive changes in your own feelings, like you just feel numb all the time. And then maybe using substances more than you should. The other thing is getting things like headaches, stomach aches, and sort of like these vague ongoing ailments that aren't related to like another medical condition, but you just have a headache all the time, right? That's not related to like migraines or FOP or whatever's going on with you. Like that might be something you would seek therapy for. And we call that a psychosomatic symptom, where our mental health is showing itself in our physical health. Again, thinking about hurting yourself or others, or killing yourself or others. Inability to kind of carry out your regular daily activities or handle problems that you normally do. And then another one that we see a lot with kind of older children and teens, especially girls, is an intense fear of weight gain or concern with appearance. When we think about teenagers too, we also, and kids, we want to think about a couple other things that maybe aren't symptoms, but are warning signs. So changes in school performance, excessive worry about school, inability to sit down and focus, frequent nightmares or disobedience and aggression, and then frequent temper tantrums that are not at the right developmental stage. So maybe you have a 10-year-old, but when they throw a tantrum, it's like watching a 2-year-old again. That would be a big red flag that you would want to talk to someone about, just about helping your kid figure that out. So again, that's kind of a lot of information about symptoms and anxiety and depression. I hope that helps clarify some things. Again, if any of this felt familiar or felt like something you see in a loved one, it's really important that they seek out a professional just to get their opinion. Because you're not supposed to diagnose yourself, not even therapists are supposed to do that. And also, there's so much more that goes into making a diagnosis. I want them to have the best care. All right, so we'll move on from kind of general, but I wanted to talk a little bit about FOP and mental health. And I talked to Danielle Coyne, like I mentioned, and she kind of gave me some ideas about what might be surfacing for you all related to mental health. And I know this is probably not a comprehensive list of issues that you all might be facing. But I'd love to hear from you all about what I am missing on this list. So I'll just go over it with you quickly. So one thing that we found is that those with chronic pain are 4 times as likely to have depression or anxiety, right? We talked earlier about how our mental health affects our physical health and vice versa, right? It's really important to think about that. Having no treatment for FOP can lead to feeling powerless, right? And often that sense of powerless can lead to feeling kind of empty or feeling despair, or it can make someone anxious about not having treatment. Difficulty moving, right, around in public or the way that you used to or the way you want to can make you feel anxious in public. And often people who have difficulty feeling comfortable with their bodies in public become more and more isolated, right? And that is obviously a symptom of depression, but also could be a symptom of something called agoraphobia, which is the fear of leaving your home. The unpredictability of your flare-ups can cause anxiety about the future, right? Just kind of not knowing what's going to happen next. Of course, that's going to make you feel anxious and nervous about what tomorrow is going to bring or what the next week or year will look like for you. And I mentioned isolation earlier, but also with limited mobility and just lack of public understanding about FOP, right? That pulling back and staying in can look like depression, right? Even though it might just be out of necessity and out of self-care, it can mirror some of those symptoms of depression. So again, these are just a few considerations that Danielle and I talked about, and so I'd love to hear if I've left something out or other things that you all consider when you think about FOP and mental health. So let me know. You all can feel free to type that in the chat. I'll give you a couple minutes.
One thing that I was curious to know about is something that I've read is people with rare diseases often feel exhausted from having to explain what their diagnosis is to people.
Yeah.
You know, you go out in public and someone asks, or you go to a new doctor or a new specialist. And so that continual sort of like reliving of your experience can be exhausting for people. So I'm also curious to know if anyone here on the webinar can relate to that, and how, Brittany, maybe that plays into anxiety or depressive disorders.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from attendees about if that rings true for them. I mean, I can definitely see how that would lead to anxiety and that kind of exhaustion, like you mentioned, right? That fatigue is a symptom of both anxiety and depression. And also, I think again, that's when we talk about toxic stress, I think that will really feel true there, because it's stressful to have to explain yourself, right? All the time about everything over and over and over again. So I can imagine that would be a huge symptom, and definitely could lead to feeling that exhaustion and that sort of like that need for people to understand what's happening with you. I hope that made sense. I feel like I just said a lot of words, not sure if they made a sentence, so sorry about that. Okay, so it's not the exhaustion, but more of people not caring or giving it a great importance, okay? And then, Michelle, I feel like I have to be emotionally prepared. Yeah. Okay, so feeling emotionally prepared, having issues with job performance, yeah, and wanting to quit that makes perfect sense to me. And I can see, Evelyn, that when you're kind of gearing up to have a conversation about that, because it's not just that you're explaining yourself, like you're explaining that something that maybe you don't have all the answers for, right? That might be scary to even talk about. And so I can imagine that would be hard to do.
And just for recording's sake, because the recording won't showcase the chat,
there
was some different takes from that. Some people think that, it's not so exhausting from having to tell or educate people about a diagnosis, but it can be frustrating just that when you educate people, there's not really a genuine sense of caring, or there's not an importance they place on it. And then some people do agree that it is really exhausting, and to face it on a daily basis is very vulnerable, because some days, just like, we all have our good days and our bad days, and on your bad days, it can be incredibly challenging to have to address that, and can be emotional on some of those bad days. So, and then another person who just said, especially when you're in a work environment, or when it has to do with your job performance, it can be, add another layer of sort of exhaustion to the process. So. And sorry, so this is, I know it's really confusing that it says Michelle Davis. This is Hope Newport, the Family Services Manager. So yes, I apologize that I can't change the name on the screen. But.
Right, and Danny says, definitely have to be emotionally prepared. Yeah, depending on her mood, she might say something, so she might go into detail about FOP, or sometimes she'll just smile. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that some people have cared and acted interested, and I'm sad that people shut you down. That is so hard. Yeah. And that, again, can feel isolating, right? That this person who should care about this does not care about what's happening with me. And well, thank you all so much for sharing that. Oh, I see. Okay, it happens with doctors a lot. And is that you feel like they don't care when you're talking about FOP? Mm-hmm. Like they know everything. Sometimes doctors do that. It's very frustrating. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so obviously none of those things are going to feel good, right? And often when we're already in this really kind of like, what's the word I want to use? We're in like a vulnerable place already, right? One, we live in an anxiety-filled culture where everything is tense a lot. And so to already be in that place, right? So that's kind of our baseline. And then we have this other level where it is we have this rare disease, right? You have a rare disease and you want people to understand it. You want people to care about it. You want for there to be treatment, right? In order for that to happen, people have to care. So when they act like they don't care or they actually don't and express that to you, I can imagine that's very isolating and frustrating. Oh, like it's a cold. Oh gosh, like, oh, you'll get over it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And that sense of rejection, thank you so much for sharing that. Feeling rejected all the time, right? And just having to do that over and over and over again, right? That can lead to some of those feelings, right? Because if, I'm trying to think of a good analogy for this. When somebody gives you the same information, right? Someone you're supposed to trust, right? A medical professional or otherwise, gives you incorrect information or the incorrect response over and over and over again, at some point people start to sort of internalize that response and believe it to be true, right? And so that rejection, you start to feel like that's how it's supposed to be, that's how I'm supposed to feel, and it becomes part of how you feel all the time, right? And so that's how these little things, right, that you experience, right, they're microaggressions, essentially, right? Those little things that you experience throughout the day, throughout the week, right? They become part of kind of like your internal workings, right? How you feel about yourself. And so that's how those little things lead to things like anxiety and depression. And when we talk about treatment, we'll talk a little bit about things that you do in treatment that will help you kind of battle some of those internal workings and thoughts. So thank you all so much for sharing. Please continue to share in the chat. I hope that, I don't pretend to have all the answers. I hope that being able to think through this has been helpful. And when we talk about treatment, I hope that that will be helpful too. So I did mention that I was going to talk about toxic stress. One, because this is what I do. In my day job, I work for a school district and I teach basically teachers and staff about brain development and how trauma affects the brain. And one of the things that I talk to them about is this idea of toxic stress, that we all need certain level of stress, right, to perform. I need to feel a little stressed right now because I'm doing a webinar and that's important and I want to make sure I get my points across and tell you all the things I want to tell you. But often when we experience that level of stress, we come back down quickly and it actually helps us build coping skills, right? And we need those to survive and to thrive. Often what happens though is we experience too much stress, right? The stress hormones in our body, cortisol and adrenaline, are so high that it actually starts to effectively poison our brains and bodies in that way, right? Our bodies aren't meant to hold that much stress at any given time. Hopefully you have someone in your life that kind of buffers that and helps you manage that stress. But often when we live in a society that's super stressful, when we are experiencing a rare disease, right? When we are experiencing discrimination based on our ability, when we feel rejected by the medical community or by others, right? That level of stress is so high that it's not, and there's no one there to buffer it, right? That becomes toxic, right? And it's really bad for us. And often when we live with a disease, right, especially a rare one, it can lead to toxic stress, right? Our hormones are operating at higher levels than what is normal. And like I said, it starts to kind of poison us and it affects the way that our brain processes information and the way that our brain functions over time. And so another way, you might have heard the word trauma before. Toxic stress, trauma is a type of toxic stress. So that might include things like abuse or neglect, sexual assault, parental separation or divorce, racism, ableism, or other forms of oppression, and sometimes even poverty could be a type of toxic stress. Yeah. So, okay, so I want to make sure I'm capturing all of this. Joseph says, basically it comes down to getting rejected all the time. There's not much you can do. It's different for us since a lot of us are isolated. So one rejection will be hard, but people get rejected all the time, and they just meet a new person and fulfill their ego. I guess that's a good idea. For us FO peers, we can't really meet multiple people to get us over the one bad experience. That bad experience stays in our memory a lot longer. It comes down to isolation, not living in normal circumstances. Yes, Joseph, that makes perfect sense to me. Because you're right, you need the relationships, right, are what heals the toxic stress or the anxiety and depression. And when you have a lack of those, right, that can really put you in a tough spot. So when we talk about treatment, hopefully that will help with some of that, because you're isolated, I think, well, we'll get to treatment. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I do want to cover briefly just some options that you all have for treatment, and I want to make sure I address the isolation and maybe not living kind of in a normal circumstance like Joseph mentioned. But medication is an option, right? And again, because of FOP, you'd want to consult with both your physician and a psychiatrist about any medications that you will be taking, just to make sure that those are safe for you. But there are a lot of medications for anxiety and depression, and a lot of people have really good success with those. There's this really popular saying in, again, mental health circles, that's like, if you can't make your own serotonin, store-bought is fine, right? If you can't make your own neurotransmitter, store-bought is fine. And it is, right? It's okay, because your brain needs those chemicals, and taking medicine to get those is okay. The other kind of treatment that I recommend, again, for everyone, is therapy, talk therapy. There's so many different styles of therapy. I'm a play therapist. There's art therapy, music therapy. There's also different approaches and techniques. One of the things that people find really helpful with anxiety and depression is something called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's very popular right now. And it helps people focus on how their thoughts and behaviors influence the way they feel and the way they see the world. Another popular one is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And the whole goal of that is that you align your personal values with your actions. And the closer your actions and your personal values get, the happier you are. And there's a million different theories and types of therapy. I could go, again, that would be like a whole 3-day conference probably. But I do tell my potential clients all the time is that the most important thing about your therapist is the relationship you build with them. And if something's not working, you have to let your therapist know, or they will usually bring it up. And it's okay to try another therapist. You're not going to be a good fit with every person, every therapist. And I tell my clients, like, I might not be for you, and that's okay. My job is to help you find the best care. And so I often will work with clients to find another therapist that maybe will meet their needs or lives closer to them or provides a certain type of therapy that I don't. And I should do that, right? My ethical obligation is that you find good quality mental health care. One of the very few good things to come out of this pandemic, I don't know that there's any more than this one, is that a lot of therapists are having to figure out how to be really good at virtual therapy. And often therapists use their own telehealth platforms, but there's also something called Talkspace and BetterHelp, and those are telehealth platforms that you can download to your phone. And often those are at a reduced cost than just like weekly in-person talk therapy. So virtual therapy is really taken off right now. And I'm pretty sure that in most places where you are, you could find a therapist who would do virtual therapy. Often there are restrictions around the state in which you live and the state in which your therapist lives. So that's important. If you live in a place like me, that's like on the state line. So you want to think about that. But most therapists are on top of that and will help you figure that out. But that is an option. And I think, Joseph mentioned that kind of being in isolation and not having normal circumstances, virtual therapy might be a really good option for you if you're experiencing that isolation and not being able to get out. There's also lots of other wellness, I guess you could call them wellness caregivers in the world. And a lot of times people supplement their therapy or medication with one of these things like yoga, meditation, or mindfulness classes. And all of these things, while they're not therapy, they try to focus on the breath, right? So how you breathe. And that often helps people regulate their emotions and mood. And so anything that helps you do that will be a great addition to therapy treatment, medication, those kinds of things. There's also some really good apps you can download on your phone. One is called Calm, and one is called Headspace. And those are two apps that you can download, and I think they do free, like a free plan or a free trial. So you could try some of the mindfulness or meditation skills just to see if that's something you like and you find helpful. So that's just kind of a brief overview of treatment. Like I said, there's a ton of different types of treatment. I would recommend, when you find a therapist, and we'll talk about how to do that in a second, when you find a therapist, asking them, like, well, what approach do you take with clients? Do you have what we call a theoretical background, which sounds very fancy, but it's just like, how do you see clients, or what's the approach you take with them? But you are interviewing that therapist. And so I think that's important for you to know, like, you get to interview this person and see if they're a good fit for you. And you should interview multiple, right? You should be asking 2 or 3 therapists that you've looked at, like, okay, tell me about what it would be like to work with you, and then see which one feels the best for you. So just a couple of other resources for you all. I did want to highlight the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, because it's 24/7 support. So you can call that number at any time, and they can provide you with other resources. I do see that question, Joseph, and I'm gonna get to that one, the insurance question. It offers 24/7 support, and they do a really good job on that lifeline. I highly recommend it. When you're looking for a therapist, I recommend that people start with Psychology Today, because you can search for a therapist based on your insurance, based on the amount that you're willing to pay, and based on your location. You can also search for, like, if you're looking for someone who does cognitive behavioral therapy, you could search for somebody who does that. I work with a lot of children of color, and so often the parents I work with are searching for a therapist of color, and so they can look for an African American therapist on Psychology Today. I did mention Talkspace and BetterHelp. Those are 2 telehealth platforms where you can receive therapy either via chat, like text messaging, phone calls, or video chat. And again, those are often at a more reduced rate than traditional therapy. If you're looking for a play therapist, I always got to plug the Association for Play Therapy. They have a directory of play therapists across the nation and across the world. And then Joseph asked a little bit about if your insurance doesn't cover any therapy. It's a really good question. So there is something called the Open Path Collective, and that often offers therapy at a significantly reduced rate, and therapists sign up to be a part of that collective, so they would provide therapy to you at a reduced rate. And I'm not sure what their rates are right now at Open Path, but they're always accepting new clients, and they will match you with a therapist that will work with you. And then again, another free helpline is the NAMI helpline. Another place you might look for a therapist who doesn't need insurance is actually on a university campus. When I was getting trained to be a therapist, we had to do so many hours in we called it the Center for Counseling and Educational, I can't even remember the rest of it. CCAS is what it was called. And at CCAS, we saw our clients for like $5 or less, but we provided therapy. We were supervised by psychologists. And so that's another great place to look. Most colleges who have a counseling program or a social work program offer a clinic like that. So that's a good place to start. And then also, many therapists offer something called a sliding scale fee. So based on your income, they will give you a rate that is lower than their standard rate if you meet their income qualifications. Often those are based on that's a good question. And I'll answer in a second. Often the rates are based on the federal poverty guidelines though, so it's important to know wherever you are kind of what that looks like. Joseph also asked, wouldn't it be better to get an experienced therapist since a lot of our problems are deep? I think that's a fair question, and I think it probably would help to get an experienced therapist. I will say that I think people get scared of the clinics at schools because they're new. They're learning how to be therapists. But like I said, they're supervised by very experienced therapists. And they've never not done therapy before. They just don't have as many hours. So they're usually really good. So I don't want people to be scared off of that. It's actually a really good experience for people. Yeah, to do that. And it's also a good way. I've seen a lot of people come and try therapy that way. They're like, well, I just want to try it and see if I like it. And so they do that for $5 a session, and then they go and they find a therapist who they would work for more long term. And another thing is some college counseling centers offer therapy to the public. So those counselors would be fully licensed, have years of experience. And so you might ask, if you're working with the university, like, do you have something like that where actual clinicians, the supervisors, are providing therapy to outside clients? I know I live in Kansas City, so the University of Missouri, Kansas City had both. We had CCAS where I went to school, and then also our college counseling center served the surrounding area public clients as well. So those are a couple of options if your insurance doesn't cover it. One thing I try to point out to people too is if you are working, right, and if your company offers something called an employee assistance program or an EAP, often you'll get 6 free counseling sessions through your EAP. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 6, but each of those, each issue that you bring gets you that number of sessions. So at my day job at a school district, our EAP gives us 6 counseling sessions per issue. So if I go in for grief, right, and I use my 6 sessions, but then that grief turns into depression, I would get 6 more for free through the EAP. So those are some other options that you would have if you don't have insurance. Often the other thing that you can do if you have an HSA or an FSA, you can use that to pay for therapy as well, like you would pay your copays. And then when you're working with therapists, ask them if they're willing to see you pro bono. So some therapists will take on clients. Usually they have a restriction. It's like 1 on their caseload. They can do 1 pro bono. So you can ask for that. And that might be another option if you don't have insurance. So it is 7 o'clock. I'm going to stop talking because I know we have some questions. Okay.
So I was going to also ask one other question that came in through email before the webinar started that we wanted to get to was, what guidance do you have for an individual with FOP who needs the support and assistance of a caregiver but finds that continued conflicts with that caregiver are creating an unhealthy emotional environment?
Yeah. So you need to be with this person, right? Whether it's a romantic relationship or a familial relationship, but it's an unhealthy relationship, right?
Yes.
Okay, making sure I got it.
Yep.
And we've already talked about this, and I'm still wanting to make sure I understand that question. So I think one of the things that we have to consider is that relationships are always happening on a spectrum, right? So anywhere in between, like really unhealthy and abusive to super happy, right? Any of those relationships, right, can be worked on. Any 2 people in a relationship can work on the relationship to make it better if both people are willing. And so I would encourage that if that's the case, right, if the caregiver that you have is not a healthy person, right, you're having unhealthy interactions, that maybe you attend family therapy with them so that you can work on making those interactions more healthy, more beneficial for both of you, because that is important, right? If you need that person, you need that relationship to be a healthy and happy one. So I would, when you're looking for therapists, look for family therapists. And some therapists have a million different kinds of letters behind their name, so don't be stressed out about that. There's LPCs, LCSWs, LMFTs. We all do the same kind of work. So it won't matter the letters behind their name as long as they have an actual license from the state. So don't stress out about that. Just know that that means they've gone to school to do this. Okay. Were there any other questions that I missed in the chat or anything? Hope.
Nope, I think that is everything from the chat. If you just want to hit the one from the Q&A.
So there's one. Okay, another one. So what if that other party doesn't believe in mental health? Okay, I'll get to that in 1 second. I want to answer Jessica's first since it came in first. So due to FOP, I move and walk differently. I'm ashamed and embarrassed. It affects dating and going out. Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that you're feeling shame. That's a big, big feeling. And I think that one of the benefits of therapy is that you get to build a relationship with a therapist or a counselor or a social worker or an MFT, right? Like I said, and that relationship is built on trust, right? And often with any diagnosis, right, that I give a client, one of the things we're working on is how they feel about themselves and how they think about themselves. And many therapists do that because we know that if our clients feel good about themselves, regardless of all the things they have going on in their life, they will have happier thoughts, right? Which lead to happier behaviors, which lead to better outcomes. And so I would, I think not feeling like you can't go out, I think that's a great reason to start maybe with virtual therapy and talking to someone that way. Again, if you don't even want to do like video chat, the BetterHelp app and the Talkspace app, you can do that through texting. And so that's a great way, like I said, to kind of, what I've seen people do is like dip their toe in therapy that way to kind of see how it feels, and then move on to in-person or talk therapy with someone. So I would still, even if you feel like your symptoms aren't as intense as what we've discussed, right, with depression and anxiety, I would still recommend therapy, because one of the things I think and feel and believe about therapy is that it helps us understand ourselves better. And I think that's always a good thing to be doing. So I hope I answered your question. And I am so sorry that you're feeling shame, because that is a hard one. Okay, so I think this is related to talking about the caregiver. This question was, what if the other party doesn't believe in therapy or mental health? Whew, that is hard, and that happens a lot in couples and family counseling. The one person's all in and the other person is not. And so I would still recommend that you seek out your own therapy, because one thing that I've learned working with kids is that I often can't change their whole environment, right? I can't always change parents. I can't always change the whole school, but I can help that kid build coping skills, right? Useful skills that will help them survive and even thrive in those unhealthy environments. So if the other party doesn't believe in it, you can't make them, right? So I would just do what you need to do to be healthy and happy. I hope that answered your question. I see another one. If you suffer from anxiety and depression and are being treated with medication, is there a time when you can come off medication? Can you grow out of it, or is it a lifelong situation because of the chemicals? Oh, that's a really good question, Lori. It depends is the answer, which is not a perfect answer, and I'm so sorry. But some people can take medication for a certain amount of time and then come off of the medication and be fine. Often women will be on anxiety medication and then will come off of it when they're trying to get pregnant or have a kid, right? Because they don't want those chemicals at that time. And then they might come back on it later. It depends on if their body can actually handle that. Now, some kids who take medication can grow out of that, right? Their bodies change so quickly over that like 18-year time span from 0 to 18, right? They can kind of grow in and out of meds. So I think that's important to remember too, is that kids are more likely to do that than adults. But the other thing I tell people is not every medication is for everybody. And so if you start taking a medication and it makes you feel worse, then you should try something different. and that's okay. The other thing about meds is that you are going to want to try them for like 3 weeks to a month before you decide if they're working or not. And you'll want to be in pretty constant contact with the prescribing physician, so you can discuss what the side effects and the symptoms and the things that you're experiencing. So medication's a big one, but you can take some for a little bit and come off depending on who you are and how that medication affects your body. So that was a big answer to a question. I hope I answered it. But that's another one of those, like, it depends on the person. Another question, what if your enjoyment is through other people, but you can't because of isolation or feel like you're not liked or for whatever reason? That's a good question. So I think that one of the things that, again, I think there's like one, maybe two good things that have come out of this pandemic, and that is that people are using virtual technology to connect with other people. So one thing that I've seen some therapists do are hosting groups, like therapy groups, right, with other people virtually. I hear a lot of people doing like virtual get-togethers with friends and family members. And then one thing that I always try to challenge my clients on is, okay, so you say you get enjoyment out of this one thing, right? How can I help you find other things that you get enjoyment out of? Because I never want clients to have only one thing that makes them happy. I want them to have a whole menu of happiness, all right, that they can pull from when things are really hard. And so, what are those things that you can do, right, when you're isolated that do bring you some joy? And then let's make that a more robust menu, because especially right now, it's hard to find those things to do with other people that aren't virtual. I will say that as a play therapist, it's been challenging to engage clients in play online. And so one of the things that I've been doing is there's a lot of like free online board games. So we can play Uno and Connect Four, and we play Pictionary online with my clients. And that's been a way that I can still be playful with them virtually. So those are just some ideas on things you can do virtually. But I do think that engaging with people online is a great way to get that sort of extrovert social stuff that you need, and then also building a more robust menu of things that make you happy when you have to be isolated, because for a long time many people had to be isolated completely because of their health and because of COVID-19. So that's a good question. Okay, I see one more.
And I also wanted to do a plug for some IFOPA programs. So some of you may be aware, but the IFOPA has several different resources to support our community's mental health. The first is our Resilient Living program. So we are doing every month we have an educational meeting where I do a short 30-minute presentation on one of our 10 facets of the Resilient Living program, one of our 10 skills for supporting our mental health. And then there's also a time to do some activities or to go through some exercises that can help support that facet. So if you haven't already heard of that, please look into our Resilient Living program. You can find more information about that at www.ifopa.org/resiliency_program. And the other thing I wanted to mention is kind of related to the social support or the connection with other people. The IFOPA has an FOP community Zoom resource. So if you're interested in setting up a Zoom call with other members in the FOP community or other members of your FOP support system, you can email me at hope.newport@ifopa.org. And I am more than happy to work with you to schedule that call and to get people registered to join you for a Zoom meetup so you can have that virtual connection. So I wanted to mention those two resources. And I also wanted to thank Brittany so much for taking the time to go through all of this with us and to really meet our community where we are. We have some very specific, rare disease needs that are more common but also some very specific FOP needs. And so thank you for understanding those and coming to teach us all that you have to share.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. Hi, Joseph. I don't actually I'm full. My caseload is full right now, so I can't take any new clients, but I hope you guys can still see my screen. I just wanted to show you Psychology Today because it is really helpful in finding a therapist. You can also search for psychiatrists and support groups on there, and you just put in your zip code. So I'll put in mine. We'll see. My face might pop up. Let's see. Oh, no. I'm not at the top of the list anymore. So you can see in my area, there's a lot of therapists, and they're all over. That's my friend Dee. She's great. So I think it's important that you really shop around for a therapist and ask really good questions, ask them if they have experience. I did reach out to some of my therapist circles and ask if anyone has experience with rare disease, and I have a couple of people who said so I'm going to send those to Hope, and hopefully she can get those out to you. I know one's in Canada, but I think the other one was local to Kansas City, so hopefully those people will be able to help and might get you some resources that you're needing right now.
Great. Well, thank you again, Brittany, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. I realize an hour and 15 minutes of your evening is valuable time, so we are so grateful for you utilizing this resource, and we hope you'll share it with your friends in the community. This recording will be available, so always definitely feel free to reference it to people who you think might need it as a support. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night, and we will hopefully hear from you all soon. Okay. Bye.
Bye.